everyone and welcome back. 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. This is Jiwon and you're listening to Understanding Korea, one story at a time, where we talk about Korean history, culture, and the very specific ways they quietly shape our everyday lives. Before we begin, I want to say I'm sorry this week's podcast is late. I actually finished recording it on time. And when I opened it in Descript, the program I use to edit my podcast, I realized that something had gone wrong. Somewhere in the middle, I must have touched the wrong setting or bumped something while recording because suddenly my voice started sounding strange and metallic, almost like a machine. It was not something I could really ask anyone to listen to, so I had to scrap that recording and do it again. But because I still wanted to get the newsletter out on time first, I ended up putting the re-recording off a little longer than I meant to. So thank you for waiting, and truly I'm sorry for the delay. Now, today's episode is the slightly strange cousin of the Warmth series. I've been writing recently about Korean postpartum care, sweet soup, heated floors, warmth, recovery, and all the ways Koreans try to protect the body from getting cold. And while we were working on those earlier posts on warmth, Jihyun, my co-writer on this newsletter, said something like, "If I were a foreign reader, this is exactly what I would ask next. If Koreans care this much about warmth, why are they all walking around in the middle of winter with ice Americano?" And then, of course, that exact comment came in. It is a fair question. In fact, it is such a fair question that it almost feels like the perfect next question. How does the same country produce postpartum recovery centers serving hot sweet soup, mothers telling you not to let your body get cold, elders telling you to keep your feet warm, and office workers heading to work on freezing winter mornings with a giant plastic cup full of ice? That is what we are talking about today. This episode grows out of this week's newsletter, but it's not just the audio version of that piece. Think of it as a companion conversation, a place for the backstory, the extra context, and a few bookish detours that didn't quite fit on the page. Because once I started researching Korea's Ice Americano obsession, I realized something. This is not just a funny habit. It is a tiny window into Korean speed, Korean work culture, Korean food culture, Korean cafe culture, and even Korean ideas about selfhood. So let's start where I started. Whenever I pick a topic, I do the same thing. First, I look for books, then papers, then articles, then videos, then at some point, I realize I now have far too many tabs open and a mild sense of panic. That happened again this week. I knew Koreans loved iced Americanos, obviously. If you have spent even a day in Korea, you know this. But I did not know there were this many books, essays, magazine pieces, think pieces, health warnings, and cultural analysis about one cold drink. Part of me was delighted. Part of me was thinking, this is fascinating. And another part of me was thinking, when exactly am I supposed to read all this? And then I had one of those moments that felt almost too perfect. I searched an academic database for materials on iced Americano culture. And the algorithm, instead of calmly staying on topic, started recommending things like, if only the belly is warm, you can live to 100. Why does eating cold things give you a headache? Cold energy is the root of all illness. And start your day with warm water. Even the database was worried about me. Honestly, that may be the funnest summary of Korea possible. You search for cold coffee, and Korea answers by handing you a blanket. That tension is the whole story. Korea is deeply invested in warmth, and yet Korea is also the land of winter iced coffee. So before we go further, let's define the creature. What exactly is 얼주가? 얼주가 is short for 얼어 죽어도 아이스 아메리카노. Literally, even if I freeze to death, iced americano. It is a very Korean phrase, compact, dramatic, slightly ridiculous, and extremely efficient. Korean slang is very good at this. It takes a whole sentence, squeezes it into a few syllables, and somehow keeps all the humor and attitude. 얼주가 is not just a menu preference. It is a declaration. It means, yes, I know it is freezing. Yes, I understand. This makes no sense. Yes, I'm doing it anyway. The phrase took off during the severe cold of 2018, spread fast through social media, and became part of everyday speech, especially among younger Koreans. And that, especially among young Koreans, part matters. Even though pretty much everybody in Korea knows what 얼주가 means now, it still carries a slightly youthful charge. When an older person orders an ice americano in cold weather, people sometimes respond almost admiringly, like, wow, you are young. As if winter ice were not just a drink choice, but a tiny badge of your youthfulness, stamina, or modern stubbornness. It also led to lots of variations, and that's very Korean. Once a phrase catches on, people start playing with it. So alongside the 얼주가, you get expressions like 따아족, literally the hot Americano tribe, as opposed to 아아족, the ice Americano tribe. That's usually when you know a phrase has become part of everyday culture, not just internet slang. And what about me? I should confess that my husband says I love coffee so much that there is probably coffee, not blood, running through my veins. But I'm not actually part of the 얼주가 tribe. I'm more of a hot Americano person, 따아족. In the summer, of course, I happily drink iced Americano. But to become a true whole season iced Americano person, maybe I have lived outside Korea for too long. Jihyun, interestingly, is 따아족 too, though in her case, that usually means a big mug of instant coffee, heavily diluted with water, first thing in the morning. And since she has lived in Korea her entire life, I suppose that proves this is not about geography. Age may have something to do with it too. At a certain point, I suspect, hot coffee starts sounding less boring and more wise. Now, before we get too philosophical, let's pause for some numbers. Korea does not just like coffee. Korea organizes itself around the coffee. One of the reports I looked at estimates Korea's annual coffee consumption at 416 cups per person in 2024, the highest in the Asia Pacific region. And another section notes that iced drinks made up 76% of beverage sales at major coffee chains, and that even in winter, iced drinks still made up more than 60% of sales at large chains. In some very cold periods, iced Americanos sold better than hot Americanos. Korea also had over 106,000 coffee shops in 2023, more than convenience stores. and one low-cost chain, Mega MGC Coffee, reportedly sold 170 million iced Americanos in a single year. At some point, iced Americano stops being a drink and starts looking like infrastructure. And that's why I think this topic matters. We are not talking about a quirky little preference. We are talking about something close to a national routine. Now, here is where the books come in. One of the first books I found was by Yi Som, and the title was irresistible. Even if I freeze to death, ice americano. 얼어 죽어도 아이스 아메리카노. I thought, well, wonderful, here comes the perfect cultural text. Surely this book will tell me everything about why Koreans love ice americano. But when I looked at the book more closely, I got a surprise. It is not really about coffee, at least not literally. It is an essay collection about self acceptance, about not living entirely by other people's standards, about stopping the endless chase to keep up with everybody else, and about learning to love the self you keep neglecting while trying to move at the speed of the world. And here's what made it even more interesting. Aside from the title, I could not find Americano anywhere in the book at all. After I finished reading it, I actually wondered if I had missed something. So I used the search function, which is one of the nice things about reading an ebook. But no, I had not missed it. The word did not really appear beyond the title. That fascinated me because it means something very specific. In Korea, even if I freeze to death ice americano no longer means only I like a cold coffee. It can also mean this is my taste, my rhythm, my way, and I'm keeping it. It becomes a comic, everyday way of saying, I know this may look impractical, but it is mine. This is why the title works even without pages of coffee analysis. The phrase itself already carries personality. It carries stubbornness. It carries selfhood. It carries that little Korean habit of turning a preference into a philosophy. And that, to me, is one of the most interesting things about this whole topic. The iced Americano is not just a beverage anymore. It is a personality type. It is almost a moral stance, a tiny over caffeinated declaration of self. So that was book one. Then book two gave me the opposite experience. The second book, Iced Americano Again Today. 오늘도 아이스 아메리카노 by Winter C really does what the title promises. This one is not using iced Americano mainly as a metaphor. It is using iced Americano as an actual daily structure, a ritual, a survival technique, a way of explaining modern life. The book begins with a scene that felt instantly recognizable. The speaker stands at the counter and does not even look at the menu because the choice has already been made. The hand moves first. The mouth moves first. One iced Americano, please. The ice clings in the clear plastic cup, and the book asks a simple question. Why do we keep drinking this every day? Its answer is not just the caffeine. It is that in a hard day, it helps to have at least one thing that does not require explanation. I loved that because, yes, caffeine matters. But anyone who has lived in Korea knows it is not just about caffeine. This book talks about the ice americano as the first thing you think of before the alarm has fully registered, as the tiny reason you get out of bed, as the one decision you do not have to make in a day already crowded with decisions. It describes the first sip as something almost like a false courage. Maybe the caffeine has not fully kicked in yet, but you feel the day begin anyway. The mind clicks on. The ritual works before the chemistry does. That is such a good insight. A lot of modern life runs on what I would call useful illusions. This will help. I can do this. Once I start, I will be okay. And in that sense, the first sip of ice americano is not just a drink. It is permission to begin. The book also has a very Korean understanding of bitterness. It suggests, in essence, that a bitter drink can feel more honest than a sweet one. Sweet coffee cushions the morning. Bitter coffee tells the truth. Today may not be easy, but here we are. We begin anyway. And then it moves into something even more recognizable, the afternoon slump. There is a section about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that heavy hour after lunch, when the first coffee has worn off, your screen looks fuzzier, your body feels heavier, and the second ice americano becomes something different from the first. The first one starts the day. The second one says, I'm not collapsing yet. The book treats that second cup almost like a small act of resistance. There is also a whole thread in the book about cafes as refuge. Not loud, social, romantic refuge. More like a modern urban refuge. A place where nobody talks to you, a place where you can sit with earbuds, a laptop, and a cold drink, and briefly occupy a small zone where no one is demanding anything from you. It is not exactly loneliness. It is more like a temporary protection. And toward the end, the book arrives at the image of the empty cup, the empty plastic cup with a few melted ice cubes left in it, as proof that you got through another day. That is such a Korean office worker image. You look at the empty cup and think, this is not glamorous, but it is evidence. I lived today. I finished something. I crossed one more ordinary, exhausting day. So when I put these two books side by side, I started seeing something bigger. In Isom's book, Iced Americano becomes identity. In Winter C's book, Iced Americano becomes survival. And maybe in modern Korea, those are not two different things. At this point, you might think, okay, so this is a very modern internet age Korean thing. Not exactly. The slang is modern, yes, but the cold coffee story is older. Coffee entered Korea in the late 19th century and is popularly associated with King Gojong, who reportedly encountered it while at the Russian legation. Koreans called it Yangtangguk, something like Western broth, which is still one of my favorite historical reminders that any foreign drink entering Korea must first pass through a soup vocabulary. Later, in 1927, Kakadu opened as the first Korean-run daebang, or coffee house. And by 1930, a 조선일보 news article was already poking fun at modern boys and girls in colonial Seoul going from place to place drinking iced coffee. So the generational side-eye is at least a century old. Youth modernity style iced coffee and adults quietly disapproving. Apparently, we have been here before, which I find comforting because it means 얼주가 is not a random fad. It is an old cultural instinct in new clothes. Now let's ask the obvious question. Why winter too? There are many reasons, but I think five matter most. First, Korea is fast. Hot coffee asks you to wait. It asks you to sip. It asks you to be patient. Iced coffee asks you almost nothing. You put in the straw and keep moving. In a culture shaped by 빨리빨리, hurry, hurry, that matters. Second, Korea is cold outside and extremely warm inside. Heated floors, strong indoor heating, tightly managed interiors. You can be freezing on the street and slightly overheated 5 minutes later in a cafe or office. So, part of the answer is very simple. By the time many Koreans are drinking iced coffee, they are no longer really in winter. They are in a heated building. Third, Korean food makes a cold, bitter, clean finish feel satisfying. There is a reason so many people want ice americano after a spicy lunch. It works like a punctuation, a reset button. The articles I read also noted that cold coffee softens certain bitter edges and that Korea's broader food culture already has a long history of strong hot cold contrasts, from broth and stew culture to cold noodles and winter cold dishes. Fourth, the low cost coffee revolution changed everything. Once large, cheap iced Americano became available on every block, coffee stopped feeling like an occasional treat and started feeling like a default setting. The rise of chains like Mega and Compose turned iced Americano into something close to a daily utility. And fifth, iced Americano fits Korea's work pattern astonishingly well. This is something the books and the reports both kept circling around. Hot coffee has a short life because it cools off too quickly. Iced coffee lasts. You can put it on your desk and let it carry you through an hour, 2 hours, sometimes more. The drink changes as the ice melts. It stretches, it lingers. It becomes a slow caffeine drip. More than one source used language very close to that. The ice americano in Korea often functions like a little IV bag on the desk. Which brings us to the cafe itself. Because you can learn a society by looking at its cafes. Coffee culture is never just about taste. Cafes tell you what kind of space a society needs. In Europe, cafes often became places of conversation, philosophy, politics, music, revolution. In New York, cafe culture became tied to networking, ambition, and the mythology of the young person building something on a napkin. A cafe can become a public living room, an office, a salon, a refuge, a place where people form new networks beyond the family and hometown ties. And Korea's cafes tell us something very specific about modern Korean life. They are often not main spaces for long public conversation in the Paris sense. They are often semi private public rooms, places where you can sit alone with a laptop, earbuds, and a drink and be left alone. Korea even has a term, 가공족, the cafe study tribe, to describe people who use cafes like study halls or personal workspaces. And one of the strongest social explanations is that because many unmarried young adults in Korea live with their parents for longer, cafes become a crucial third place. Not home, not school, not work, but a place to be oneself without too much family observation or household pressure. And for young people who move to Seoul from other parts of the country and end up living in tiny dorm rooms or 고시원, those famously crammed one-room lodgings, cafes often become something even more practical, an extension of personal space. That is why I think the cafe matters so much in this story. The drink and the space belong together. The Korean cafe says you may not have a big apartment, a private office, or a lot of unstructured time, But for the price of one drink, you can rent a corner of autonomy. And if the Korean cafe is the rented corner of autonomy, then the Ice Americano is the perfect tenant. It is efficient, lasts a long time, does not require constant attention, and visually fits the whole scene. Clear plastic cup, laptop open, earbuds in, work or study in progress. It is not just a drink, it is part of the architecture. While I was going down this rabbit hole, I also ran into people using warm ice Americano as a way to describe a person. The example that kept popping up in Korean fan conversations was BTS Suga. The idea is simple. Someone who seems cool, dry, or a little distant on the surface, but is actually warm and thoughtful underneath. I do not want to make too much of that, but I do think it is telling. Once a drink becomes a personality metaphor, it has moved well beyond the beverage status. It has become cultural shorthand. Cold looking, warm hearted, efficient outside, emotional inside. Slightly contradictory, completely understandable once you know the context. That honestly is a pretty good description of a lot of Korean culture. So, is this the opposite of Korean warmth culture? I don't think so. I think it is one of its modern descendants. That is the twist I kept coming back to. At first glance, my recent posts about postpartum care, warmth, heated floors, seaweed soup, and protecting the body seem to point in one direction, while Orjuga points in the opposite direction. But Korean body culture is not simply warm is good, cold is bad. It has often been about timing, balance, sensation, and regulation. This is a culture that gives you samgyetang, a steaming hot chicken soup with ginseng in the middle of summer, under the logic of year cheer. The idea that you fight heat with heat. In that sense, Ice Americano is not the betrayal of Korean care culture. It is Korean care culture translated into urban modernity. Some things in Korea are supposed to be kept warm. The body after childbirth, the floor, the soup, the stomach. But some moments call for something else. A jolt, a reset, a little bitterness, a little cold, a cup that says, I'm going to wake up now. I'm going to get through this meeting. I'm going to survive 2 o'clock. I'm going to claim one tiny preference in a day full of things I did not choose. That is why I think Ice Americano became so much more than a drink in Korea. It is a routine, a tool, a pause button, a caffeine system, a personality type, a class-friendly luxury, a work accessory, a small rebellion, and sometimes a way of saying, I know myself. Before I go, one more thing I liked from the second book. One of the loveliest ideas in Iced Americano Again Today is the thought that a tiny repeated action can become the first sentence of your day. Not a grand resolution, not a perfect morning routine, just a first sentence. You wake up, you move toward the cafe, you order the same thing. You take the first sip, and that is how the day begins. I think there is something very human in that. We often imagine meaningful lives as being built from big dramatic decisions. But sometimes a life is built from smaller repetitions. The thing you order, the place you sit, the time of day when you need the second cup. The fact that the empty cup on your desk can feel, weirdly, like evidence that you made it through. And before I end, two quick notes. Next week, I'll be back with a book review. It's a book that offers a deep and fascinating look at what it means to be Sikh in Korean society. Then after that, I'll be taking 1 week off on April 10 because it's my daughter's spring break. Going forward, my newsletter and podcast will take a small seasonal break, once in the spring, once in the summer, and 2 weeks in the winter. Thank you so much for your understanding. And thank you always for reading, listening, and joining me on this journey of getting to know Korea together. So maybe that is the final thing I want to say. If you want to understand Korea, do not only look at palaces, politics, or pop culture. Look at what people are holding on the subway at 8 in the morning. Look at the coffee cups on office desks. Look at the cafes full of quiet people with laptops and earbuds. Look at the person ordering ice americano in January without a second of hesitation. There is a lot of Korea in that one cold cup. There is speed in it, and fatigue, and efficiency, and taste, and habit, and youth culture, and work culture, and the search for third place, and a funny little declaration of self. Cold coffee? Yes, but also a very warm clue. Take care and see you next week. 오늘도 들어주셔서 감사합니다. 다음 주에 만나요. Bye.